And so I'm closing now, and what I want to say is these two lives of E.C. Warner and May Wright Sewall, they're in a kind of partnership, because E.C. Warner earlier says something similar. He says this in 1911. He says, "If it is sweet to die for one's fatherland, how much sweeter should it be to live for one's country?" He doesn't talk about the virtue of courage. Maybe it's implied in that, but he is recognizing that there's something higher, like living for your country is better. But he says that in 1911, before we go to war and before the 1914 quote. But nevertheless, they are working in a kind of partnership. And I'll close with, this shield, which is on these flags. And these hands represent the hand of a woman. I don't know if you can see the long fingernails, okay? That should be painted maybe. And the hand of a man. This is expressly, like, you can go into the May Wright Sewall scrapbook and you can go read that this is the symbolism of it. And these are wings that are lifting, okay? And the idea is, if you want to sort of lift humanity to the next level, men and women have to work together in partnership. They have to work together in partnership. That's why I'm very interested in May Wright Sewall and her husband. And when we think about partnership, don't just think of, okay, husband and wife, but intergenerational partnership as well, right? So I don't think they knew each other, but there's a kind of partnership there, and it's, E.C. Warner working with May Wright Sewall. So it is an intergenerational partnership that involves all genders. And that is the end. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, I think is there a microphone? There it is. And we ask you to speak into the microphone because we're recording, and to get the question into the camera, you need to speak into the microphone. Dr. Fuller.
Well, that hand went up so fast, there's no denying you. Anyway, very nice talk. The one thing I was just a little puzzled about, I understood why we're talking about Warner, because of his connections to Central Michigan. Maybe I missed something in the beginning. Why was May Wright Sewall selected? Could you just put this in?
Sure. So actually, because, for two reasons, at least. One is Warner was also involved in the suffrage movement. And so he is inheriting the work that May Wright Sewall, Susan B. Anthony, so he's coming into suffrage in like 1914, and at least the story that's told is the organized women's movement begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. So there's so much work that's done. And he's interacting with Alice Paul, who's like third generation. Okay? So one of the reasons why to bring her in is because she was working with Susan B. Anthony. She was a foremost suffragist. Another reason is she's also working on the peace movement. And I didn't talk about the International Council of Women's role in the peace movement, but they were absolutely involved, and they did some important things, including, I mentioned celebrating Peace Day. But the third reason is because we have her scrapbooks. And it was another discovery that I made. So when I gave my talk last year, I wasn't aware of these possessions of the May Wright Sewall scrapbooks. And so I thought it's so interesting that Warner was a supporter of suffrage. We have these scrapbooks of this suffrage worker who was also involved in the peace movement. And I just thought it would be leveraging the two figures to talk about both of them. Does that answer your question?
Just where is she from?
She's from Indianapolis, but she actually spent some time in Michigan and lived in Paw Paw for a time. And her first husband, they actually taught in Michigan, and she was working with her first husband also in a school, and she was, I read in some places they say she was a principal, and in one article in her scrapbooks it says she was the first female superintendent in Michigan. They then moved to Indianapolis, and that's really where, and she's quite well known in Indianapolis. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for a really interesting talk. So it actually, since you mentioned Alice Paul, that got me thinking again about that alternative definition of courage, the kind of fortitude that it takes, as Alice Paul did, to stand out in front of the White House, picketing every day, despite being hated, despite having things thrown at her, despite being arrested. And I'm curious if there's anything in Warner's records that you've come across or become aware of in that period in terms of how he's judging the suffrage activity and the peace activity of Alice Paul at this time. I mean, he comes down, it sounds very harshly, on the case of Herman Hyman and talks about, our boys, and when he's focused on the case of men, seems to really be focused on that militaristic, masculinist idea of courage. But I'm wondering, what kind of attitude he took towards that kind of radical suffrage activity during the war period. Or if there's anything, if not Warren, or anything else that you might have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. The only thing that comes to mind right away, and there's no, I haven't gone through everything, so there could be something there that speaks directly to that. But in his essay on suffrage that I showed from 1914, he does make a reference to the so-called militant suffragists in England. They're called militant because they are, throwing stones and breaking windows and destroying property. And he acknowledges that that's happening. And what he says is, yeah, give them a break. Naturally, they're going to do that. So he kind of accepts that as a legitimate response. And he says something like, when people have been denied a right for so long, it's only natural that they're going to get overly excited when they start to advocate for that right. So he's definitely tolerant of that in a way that some people were not, and including women who's actually, to go back to education, the first woman to get a PhD in the United States. That happened in 1877. And you'll like this one because I know you know who her husband is. Her husband is Andrew Dixon White. And she was the first, her name is Helen Mago White. And when she learns about the militant suffragists and the destruction of property, she is just outraged at this. And she writes a letter, and I'm not going to give you any more money, and this kind of thing. So anyway, Warner has a different response, and maybe that's because he's sort of accepting of a kind of militarism. So that's the only thing I can think of.
We're going to do one more question, and then we have a reception waiting for us. So I'm going to invoke the mercy rule where we all get to go talk to the author with refreshments in a few moments. Sir, you get the last word.
Warner seemed to view war, a traditional view of wars involving defending your country, but in reality, in many wars, at least one country is acting more aggressively, as Germany in World War I, or the United States, arguably at certain periods of the Spanish-American War and possibly Vietnam. So the soldiers fighting a war that's in a broad sense more aggressive, that it's kind of a fallacious argument to say they're defending their country. I mean, an extreme example would be Germans in World War II. I'm sure the government propagandized them that they're just defending their country, whereas in reality they're over in Russia massacring people. And so that argument that Warner makes is a very unfortunate one and kind of ironic in that he's someone who's was involved with the peace movement.
Yeah, I really don't. I agree with what you're saying in terms of it's not always about self-defense. And Warner was extremely well-read in history, and he does comment about World War I, actually. He says it's not about self-defense and it's about racial hatred. He actually says that. So he's aware of the use of force for reasons other than self-defense. And I should say also, Maywright Sewall, and this is all of this I've read in the archives. All of these things I'm saying are in the archives. She says she supports the right of people to defend their country, but personally, she would not want to take a life. So she says that.
Hope, thank you for a very interesting presentation. If you have questions, as I said, a reception is awaiting us in the Clark Library. Thank you all for attending this evening. Good evening.